as we turn right now to the Turkish Prime Minister, Ahmet Davutoglu, who said that the suicide bombers may have been responsible.
Bu saldırıyla ilgili araştırmaları da sürdüreceğiz.
We will continue our investigation regarding this attack. At the moment, potential groups that can carry out such an attack are obvious: Daesh, PKK, leftist MLKP, and DHKPC. A comprehensive investigation is underway regarding potential suspects.
Sağlık Bakanımız, İçişleri Bakanımız.
Our ministers of health, justice, and interior affairs have given detailed information with regards to the attack. According to the evidence we have, there are strong suggestions that this attack was carried out by 2 suicide bombers.
Speaking Saturday, HDP leader Selahattin Demirtaş condemned the remarks made by the Turkish Prime Minister following the attacks.
They came to a point implying that the HDP bombed its own rallies and killed people to gain sympathy and votes. The Prime Minister talked about half an hour. He spares 20 minutes insulting us. The Prime Minister spends half of the time threatening me while talking about an event where 100 people lost their lives. Did you hear one word of condemnation of ISIS? No.
Our guests are Hisyar Özsoy, member of the Turkish parliament, speaking to us from Turkey. He's a member of the HDP. And Asli Bâli, UCLA professor and co-editor of the Turkey pages of Deadliest. Can you start off, Professor Bâli, speaking about who organized the peace rally?
So there are many labor organizations involved, in addition to the HDP, as you already heard from your other guest, including the Confederation of Public Sector Trade Unions, the Confederation of Progressive Trade Unions, the Turkish Medical Association, the Chambers of Turkish Engineers and Architects, and so forth. So this was a left and Kurdish demonstration designed to call for peace and to denounce the turn that the government has overseen since the June 7th elections towards conflict, escalation, polarization, and violence.
And why was it called for this weekend? Talk about the significance of HDP, its progress in gaining seats in the parliament.
So the broader context for what's happened is that on June 7th, there were parliamentary elections, and the AKP expected to win an outright majority, as it has done in every election that it's competed in since 2002. It was denied that outright majority, and the reason for this was particularly interesting. So for the last decade or so, we've had 3 parties in parliament: an ultranationalist party, secular Republican party, and the AKP. And they have had a sort of stable vote share divided amongst them, with the AKP having the lion's share of seats in parliament. This is largely because there's an electoral threshold in the country, which means that parties that poll up to 9%, or at least under 10%, get that share of the vote but fail to secure any seats in parliament. They're excluded from parliament unless they gain 10% of the electoral share nationwide. And this is a tactic that historically had been used to deny both Islamist parties and Kurdish parties seats in parliament. The tactic failed spectacularly with respect to Islamist parties since the rise of the AKP, and even before that, in that they were able to exceed that threshold easily. So we've had pro-Islamist parties in parliament since the mid-1990s. Unfortunately, however, Kurdish parties, particularly because their constituencies were often concentrated in particular provinces, were unable nationwide to exceed that threshold and have not been able to be seated in parliament other than as independent candidates. On June 7th, something very different happened, and the HDP polled at 13% and was able to not only be seated in parliament, but retain the entire block of its constituency, which meant what ordinarily happens is if a party is not able to get past the threshold, its seat share is then distributed to the next most popular party, which inevitably has been the AKP, which then gains all of those seats. So not only did the HDP gain its own seats, it deprived the AKP of the Kurdish seats that it expected to have. And this led the AKP, which had already shown signs of abandoning the so-called peace process that they had initiated with the Kurdish community 3 years earlier. They had already shown signs of abandoning that peace process when they began to isolate Abdullah Öcalan, one of the leaders of the Kurdish movement in Turkey, who they had been negotiating with until that point. They started isolating him in the spring, and they'd shown signs of disinterest in this. And all of this is connected to President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's presidential ambitions. What I mean by that is he is currently president, but he wants to alter the constitutional system of Turkey to turn it into a presidentialist system, as he puts it, by which he means an extraordinary reallocation of powers to the executive and specifically to the office of the president itself, to alter the Turkish constitutional order from one in which you have both a parliament and a president, and the president is relatively weak in powers, at least from his perspective, to one where much of the parliamentary power goes to the president. This would require a constitutional amendment, and in order to secure a constitutional amendment, the AKP needs more than the vote share that it gets, more than the seats that it has in parliament. It had hoped to form a coalition with the Kurds by introducing this peace process and having basically, a tit-for-tat exchange essentially with the Kurds, whereby the coalition around the peace process would also support these other ambitions of the AKP. And it became clear earlier this year that was not going to happen, that the Kurdish community was not going to support this ambition. And the AKP began turning its back on that peace process well before the election. But once the election delivered the stunning result that the HDP had been seated and had gotten 13% of the electoral turnout, and that the AKP was unable to secure a majority in parliament for the first time, the direction turned extraordinarily sharply towards escalation, polarization, divisiveness, driven by the president and targeting specifically the HDP internally, in addition to the PKK as part of a military campaign.
How does this fit into the larger picture with Syria?
So, as again, Hisyar Özsoy was mentioning, the Turkish government has long supported Sunni extremist groups in Syria against President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and has openly called for Assad to be ousted, has demanded that he has to go, has insisted that that's a precondition for any other kind of negotiation on Syria, and opened its border, created an incredibly porous border with Syria, enabling fighters to escape to Turkey, enabling Gulf businessmen to come and engage in finance activities and arming of groups in Syria in the southeast of Turkey. There was a tremendous amount of back and forth across the border, enabling Syrian opposition groups, many of them Islamist groups, to have a basically secure base in Turkey from which to operate and then cross into Syria. In addition, the Turkish government, by many accounts, has been directly supporting some of these Islamist fighters. And again, you heard Hisyar Özsoy make that claim. And that has been the broader picture of the Turkish campaign until, again, this summer, after the elections. The Turkish government had taken the position that the United States could not use NATO bases in Turkey to engage in aerial bombardment of the Islamic State until July of this year. In July, following a bombing which again targeted Kurdish activists and which again was suspected to be the act of the Islamic State, the Turkish government decided to claim publicly that it was going to join the anti-Islamic State coalition run by the United States, open its air bases to U.S. planes, and join the air campaign. What ensued is, yes, the United States has been able to use those bases, but in terms of the air campaign that the Turks have opened, this is in Incirlik and the Adana area. In terms of the air campaign that the Turkish government itself has undertaken, it's been entirely against the PKK. There have been basically tiny proportion of attacks on the Islamic State by Turkey, and a huge
So they get money from the United States to attack ISIS, but they use it to attack their own enemies.
They join a coalition with the United States allegedly against the Islamic State, and then they use that cover of the coalition to go after PKK. So basically they've radically escalated the militarization of their own conflict with the PKK, and this is in the broader context of U.S. policy on Syria, which has enabled the Turkish government to go forward with this campaign.
I want to go to more comments made by the HDP leader, Selahattin Demirtaş. He addressed the Turkish Prime Minister directly in his comments following Saturday's horrific attacks in Ankara that may have killed as many as 128 people.
As Prime Minister, without shame, you said you arrested the perpetrator of the Suruk bombing. You stated this an hour ago. You said, "We arrested Abdurrahman Asukos and give him to the hands of our judiciary system." In fact, Abdurrahman Asukos, the suicide bomber, blew up into pieces. Whom did you arrest? To which judiciary system did you transfer him? Is it possible that any good can come from someone who lies like this when addressing the nation? Has there been even one massacre in which you found the criminals responsible? Did you find who did the Roboski massacre? Did you find who murdered the kids in Gezi protests? Did you find out who bombed our Diyarbakir rally? Is the Suruk massacre resolved? This massacre will not be brought to justice either, because there are no dark hands behind it. They are conveying the message, we can kill you and blow you up into pieces in broad daylight, in the middle of Ankara. This is not just an attack on us. They want to give this message. We can kill anyone who stands up against us, AKP, and cover it up.
The HDP leader. Let's go to Hisyar Özsoy, who's joining us from Turkey, member of the Turkish parliament, who has gone now to several funerals after this horrific terrorist attack on Saturday, where the government estimates, I think they're saying 97 people were killed. Others are saying 128 people were killed. If you could respond to what the leader of the HDP just said, and as we wrap up, what you think needs to happen right now.
Our chair, Selahattin Demirtaş, is rightfully saying that the government never investigated the previous attacks. In Diyarbakir, our meeting on June 5th, where many people were killed, they only found the person who did it, but they never went deeper into the situation. Who are the people who organized this event? It's not a simple event. You are doing a bombing attack in the unofficial capital of the Kurds, Diyarbakir, very symbolic place. And then the Suruç incident happened, and we don't know really what is happening, behind what we see. Yeah, a young man did it, but then, who organized this whole event? In Ankara, again, the government never investigates these kinds of attacks, and we are not really optimistic in that regard. The most probably without some sort of help from Turkish intelligence or some state authorities, it's not really that easy to organize such a massive event and kill more than 130 people. And if that is the case, if there is no, state involvement or intelligence involvement in this whole situation, then it seems that, the Turkish state is definitely not functioning. They are not able to protect their own citizens in their capital city, and the attack happened about, 3 kilometers away from the Turkish parliament.
And Hisyar, what are people saying at the funerals? What are they demanding now?
They are trying very hard, incredibly hard, not to somehow transform this whole situation into revenge. So they are angry. There is incredible sorrow and anger, but they are trying to prevent this from turning into a feeling of revenge. And they are insisting. And the Turkish state wants war. And this event, let me also clarify this event happened on the day when PKK declared unilateral ceasefire, right? And this ceasefire was responded, this truce was responded by this event. And the same night, actually, on the day of the event, nobody talks about this, but the Turkish Air Force, they attacked PKK bases in a place close to my hometown, 70 kilometers away from my hometown, and killed 8 to 11 PKK militants who weren't fighting, who were just staying in their position because there is unilateral ceasefire now, a truce, at least until the elections. And so the fight is going on, but we are insisting. We insist on our demand, which is peace. And this is also for the memory of the people who we lost. It was a peace rally, and we are insisting on this politics of peace at a time when the state is most aggressive and most militaristic. And we don't know really. We don't know whether we can survive or how we can counter this massive violence. We are trying to keep people calm and to concentrate on the elections. In 3 weeks, we are going to have the elections, and we want to stop Erdogan there. But Erdogan is keeping us busy with all kinds of attacks and bombings and funeral ceremonies, and he chose to do the elections under the shadow of this war and death, this regime of death. We will insist on politics of peace, and hopefully on November 1st, we are going to stop him again, and people are committed. Despite all this chaos and instability and panic and shock, we are trying to concentrate on our election campaigns. There was a 3-day mourning period. We didn't do any campaign or any activity regarding the elections, but tomorrow we'll start again, and we'll do our best to stop Erdogan in a democratic way by voting on November 1st. And
We're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you both for being with us. Of course, we'll continue to follow what's taking place in Turkey. Hisyar Özsoy, member of the Turkish parliament, the HDP party, and Asli Bâli, international law professor and incoming director of the Near Eastern Studies Center at UCLA in Los Angeles. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, tens of thousands marched in Washington, D.C., 20th anniversary of the Million Man March, and today is Columbus Day for some, Indigenous Peoples Day for others. We'll be back.